In a historic decision, the Supreme Court has fundamentally changed American trade policy. On September 15, 2025, the court struck down the Trump-era tariffs on Chinese goods, ruling that the executive branch overstepped its constitutional authority. The justices found that using broad national security and emergency powers to justify sweeping tariffs was inconsistent with Congress's intent. This decision reasserts that the power to regulate foreign commerce belongs to Congress, not the president. For years, presidents shaped trade policy with minimal congressional input. Now that era is over. The ruling specifically limits the use of Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act and the International Emergency Economic Powers Act as blanket justifications for tariffs. The court concluded that these laws were stretched far beyond their intended scope. The sudden removal of tariffs creates both opportunity and uncertainty for businesses that had restructured supply chains. While tensions with China remain, the president can no longer unilaterally impose broad tariffs. Future actions will require explicit congressional approval. For consumers, the end of tariffs could mean lower prices on everyday goods, easing the cost of living. However, domestic industries that benefited from tariff protection now face renewed foreign competition. The Supreme Court's decision marks a major rebalancing of power and sets the stage for a new era in U.S. economic policy. The consequences will ripple through every sector of the economy, from workers to corporations. At the heart of the court's decision is a core constitutional question: who controls trade with foreign nations? The Constitution gives this power to Congress, but over time, Congress delegated much of it to the president for flexibility. The legal battle centered on whether the president's use of these powers went too far, turning temporary measures into permanent policy. The court agreed that Congress cannot hand over its essential legislative function entirely. The ruling revives the non-delegation doctrine, making clear that Congress must provide clear guidance when delegating authority. In the case of the China tariffs, the court found the definition of national security was so broad, it gave the president a blank check. This decision is a direct response to decades of expanding presidential power in economic matters. The president still leads foreign relations, but the nuts and bolts of trade policy now firmly return to Congress. The ruling could spark new legal challenges and force Congress to clarify the limits of presidential economic powers. The balance of power in trade policy has shifted permanently. Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act allowed the president to impose tariffs if imports threatened national security. Historically, this was used sparingly for critical defense materials. The Trump administration expanded it to cover broad categories like steel and aluminum, even from allies, arguing these industries were vital for security. Critics said this was a stretch, warning it raised costs for U.S. manufacturers and consumers. The Supreme Court ruled that using Section 232 as a catch-all for protectionism was unconstitutional. The court clarified that only a credible direct threat to defense capabilities justifies such tariffs, not general economic competition. This sharply limits future presidents' ability to use national security as a pretext for broad tariffs. Section 232 returns to its original narrow purpose, addressing specific tangible threats. The era of using national security as a blanket excuse for trade barriers is over. The other major tool for the tariffs was IEPA, designed for emergencies like sanctions or terrorist threats, not long-term trade disputes. The Trump administration used IEPA to declare a national emergency over China's trade practices, escalating tariffs. Critics argued this was a misuse, stretching the definition of emergency to cover chronic policy issues. The Supreme Court agreed, ruling that IEPA cannot be used to bypass established trade laws for general tariffs. Only true emergencies, not ongoing disputes, justify IEPA's powers. This decision curtails the president's ability to declare emergencies for economic leverage. IEPA returns to its original role, a targeted tool for real crises, not a shortcut for trade wars. The immediate aftermath of the Supreme Court's decision is a shockwave through the economy. For consumers, the end of tariffs means lower prices on everything from electronics to clothing, boosting purchasing power. Retailers and manufacturers who rely on Chinese imports celebrate the cost savings and potential for higher profits. But companies that shifted supply chains away from China now face tough choices: stick with costlier alternatives or return to old suppliers. Domestic industries like steel and aluminum, once shielded by tariffs, now face fierce foreign competition and fear job losses. The ruling has picked winners and losers, with downstream manufacturers benefiting and primary producers bracing for impact. The stock market reflects this divide. Retail and tech stocks surge, while industrial firms stumble. Logistics companies prepare for a rush of imports, creating new challenges at ports and in shipping. The decision forces thousands of businesses to rethink strategies built around permanent tariffs. While the removal of tariffs simplifies trade, it injects new uncertainty into the corporate world. The economic landscape is being redrawn in real time. The Supreme Court's decision creates clear winners and losers across American industry. Sectors dependent on imports like electronics, apparel, and footwear see immediate relief and lower costs. These savings could mean lower prices for consumers and new investment in U.S. design and retail. Meanwhile, steel and aluminum producers lose their protective wall, facing renewed competition from subsidized Chinese rivals. Unions warn of job losses and call for new congressional support, such as targeted subsidies or trade remedies. For many manufacturers, especially those using steel and aluminum, input costs drop, making their products more competitive. The ruling exposes the classic trade-off. Protecting one industry often hurts another. The focus now shifts to Congress for new strategies, investments in R&D, workforce training, and infrastructure to boost competitiveness. Trade disputes may move to international bodies or new trade agreements. The debate over how to support U.S. industry isn't over, it's just moved to a new arena. The era of broad, unilateral tariffs is finished. The future will be shaped by more targeted, collaborative approaches. The Supreme Court's decision reverberates globally, forcing China and the EU to rethink their strategies. In Beijing, the ruling is seen as a win. Tariffs that hurt Chinese exports are gone, offering economic relief. But Chinese leaders know the rivalry with the U.S. remains, and Congress could still enact new restrictions. The battleground shifts from the White House to Capitol Hill, making future U.S. trade actions less predictable for China. For the EU and other allies, the decision is a welcome return to rules-based trade. Allies hit by U.S. tariffs see this as a chance to rebuild trust and pursue closer cooperation on shared challenges, especially regarding China. The ruling may open the door to renewed transatlantic trade talks and a unified front in the WTO. Globally, the decision brings stability, ending the era of unpredictable, tweet-driven tariffs. Businesses and investors gain confidence from a more process-driven U.S. trade policy. Future U.S. trade actions will be slower and more deliberate, subject to legislative checks. While not ending all trade tensions, the ruling lowers uncertainty and reinforces international economic law. The world is watching as America redefines its role in global commerce. The most lasting impact of this case is the restoration of constitutional checks and balances in trade policy. The Supreme Court has handed control of trade back to Congress, ending decades of unchecked presidential authority. Now, Congress must lead on trade strategy, facing intense lobbying and the challenge of building consensus in a polarized environment. The process will be slower and more transparent, involving public debate and legislative coalitions. This shift makes U.S. trade policy more stable and representative, though less nimble. Foreign governments will know that any deal with the U.S. requires congressional approval, adding a new layer of complexity. In the long run, policies forged through Congress are more likely to reflect national consensus and endure across administrations. Presidential unilateralism brought speed but also instability. Congressional leadership promises predictability. The Supreme Court hasn't dictated trade policy, it's clarified who gets to decide Congress. The future of U.S. trade will be shaped by elected representatives, not executive orders. The rules of the game have changed for good. The Supreme Court's decision ushers in a new era for American trade strategy. Unilateral executive action is out, congressional debate is in. The challenge now is forging bipartisan consensus on America's economic goals, protecting jobs, lowering costs, or confronting rivals like China. Congress may pursue targeted industrial policies, investing in critical sectors like semiconductors and green tech. The U.S. can now lead alliances for high-standard trade agreements, setting global rules on digital trade, labor, and the environment. The debate moves from the Oval Office to the public square, making trade policy more democratic and durable. The transition will be turbulent, but the outcome is a system more aligned with constitutional principles. The future of American trade will be determined by legislative compromise, not executive decree. This new path may be slower, but it promises a more strategic, stable, and representative approach. The next chapter of U.S. trade policy begins now, with Congress at the helm.